Hey there, I'm R.K. Livingston, and here we are again at the Storybox for chapters 16 to 18 of Elijah's Boy. In our last episode, Nathaniel managed to get out of the city without being followed, and he's done so with the help of King Ahab's chief steward, Obadiah, who turns out to have been a follower of Yahweh. Now, he and Elijah are forced to flee Israel because Elijah's life is in danger and he's being hunted. And so they travel to Zarephath, which is a small town in Sidon, and that is where they find refuge with a widow and her young son. And on the very first day that they meet this widow, Milcah, Nathaniel is witness to something that can only be explained as a miracle. And for the first time, with his own eyes, he's seen the power of Yahweh, Elijah's God. And so let's carry on from there with chapter 16. It was peaceful living at Milcah's house on the outskirts of Zarephath. Elijah and Nathaniel had beds up on the roof, while the widow and her son stayed in the room below. As far as the boy could tell, the people of the town showed no interest in Milcah's guests. Perhaps they just assumed that they were relatives of some sort. Elijah did not venture into the town. He said that he was waiting, though he never said just what he was waiting for. Nathaniel soon stopped asking. Instead, he did his best to make himself useful to the woman whose home they shared. Whenever he came into the house, he found himself checking on the flour and oil. It doesn't matter how much of it we use in a day, he observed. In the evening, the sack and the jar are full. Of course, laughed Milcah. Did not Elijah say that God would provide? She believed without question that Yahweh had delivered them from death, and her newfound faith was boundless. If Elijah had not warned her to keep silent about it, she might have shouted it from the street corners. Joktan grinned at Nathaniel from his place on the bench. He no longer bore any resemblance to the wasted child they had met on the day of their arrival. With food to eat, he'd soon regained his strength and the sparkle in his eyes. He tended to follow Nathaniel around like an adoring puppy, and the older boy watched over him with a protective eye. Together they roamed the streets, with Joktan pointing out the olive presses and pottery ovens and the bronze figurines that Zarephath was famous for. He showed Nathaniel the small temple in the center of town, and they spent many happy hours watching the boats come and go in the nearby port. The days became weeks, and the weeks became months, with nothing to disturb their quiet existence. Nathaniel began to watch Elijah for signs of restlessness. It wouldn't do to get too comfortable. Much as he loved feeling part of a family, he suspected it wouldn't last. Sooner or later, the prophet would decide it was time to do something. Then one morning, as Joktan clambered about in the branches of the fig tree behind the house, Milcah came hurrying into the yard with water from the well. Where is Elijah? Nathaniel jumped up at the urgency in her tone. He's gone on one of his walks, he explained. What is it? There is news in the town. They're saying that King Ahab of Israel is still searching for him. The queen is furious. She has ordered that the prophets of Yahweh be put to the sword wherever they are found. They say that many have died already. Is he in danger here, do you think? Milcah shook her head. I don't think anyone suspects who he really is. Nathaniel was not convinced. Even in this quiet place, the air seemed charged with menace. They were killing the prophets of Yahweh. Who knew what spies might be lurking in Zarephath? Perhaps it would be best if they moved on. In spite of Milcah's assurance, he had lost his feeling of security. Elijah would know what to do. All the rest of that day, Nathaniel paced up and down the yard, waiting. The evening meal passed, and still Elijah did not come. When everyone else retired to their beds, he went to watch from the rooftop. The hours passed, and Nathaniel fought to suppress a yawn. He'll probably be out all night, he muttered in disgust. His eyes strayed to his bed. He would just sit down for a few minutes. A footstep, a soft rustling. Nathaniel's eyes flew open. It was morning, and Elijah was there. He'd been waiting for him, But why? Then his sleep-fuddled mind began to clear, and he scrambled to his feet, all his anxieties returning in a flood. "Elijah, there's news," he blurted out. "From Israel." Elijah swung around to face him. "Tell me," he commanded, his expression fierce. Nathaniel remembered the night near Samaria when Elijah had known that they must flee even before he had a chance to warn him. Did he know something now? He shivered a little as he thought of what he had to say. "The king is still searching for you," he reported. They're putting the prophets of Yahweh to death." Elijah turned away without speaking, but Nathaniel could see that the hand gripping the staff was white-knuckled with strain. He waited for some response. When it came, it was not what he expected. "I must return to Israel and present myself to Ahab." "What?" cried Nathaniel. "That cannot be your plan. I told you they're putting the prophets of Yahweh to death." "Nevertheless, I will go. God has commanded it." "But it's madness!" Nathaniel was growing desperate. "You must be mistaken. Why would he command you to go to your death? What have you done to deserve such a fate?" "Would you tempt me to disobey him?" thundered Elijah. Then his tone softened. "Nathaniel, my life belongs to God. If he should require it of me, then so be it. I'm not afraid. I will obey him no matter what the cost." Nathaniel stared. Was any God worthy of such devotion? Elijah tilted the boy's chin up with one calloused finger. "Don't question this. He has a plan, and I must be a part of it. That is my choice. You must make your own choice. I release you from your promise to serve me. You are free to follow your heart." There was a clatter from below, and Milcah came flying up the stairs, her hair in wild disarray. She threw herself at the prophet's feet and clutched at his robe. "It's Joktan," she cried. "He woke with a terrible fever. He's so sick. I'm afraid." Nathaniel did not wait to hear more, but hurried downstairs ahead of the others. Joktan, his companion, his young admirer, his friend. He had been fine yesterday. Now he was tossing and turning and struggling to breathe. When he laid a hand on the boy's flushed forehead, it was burning with fever. He turned desperate eyes to the tall figure of Elijah in the doorway. Milcah stood wringing her hands. She was right to be afraid. It was just such a fever that had killed his father. Chapter 17. Nathaniel did not believe there would be a physician in Zarephath, but he had to ask. "Oh, there are physicians in Sidon, but not here, not for such as we are. The people go to the temple, to the priest." "No!" Elijah did not raise his voice, yet the word struck them like a blow. "You must do what you can. Yahweh is merciful, and I will pray." He left, and they heard him climbing the stairs to the roof. For a moment they stood in frozen immobility. Then there was a low moan from the child on the bed, and Milcah rushed to his side. Nathaniel tried to remember scraps of talk he had heard when his father was sick. "We should raise his head to ease his breathing," he suggested, "and we should bathe him with cool water." Milcah nodded and went to a wooden chest where she produced some soft cloths. Having something to do seemed to steady her. She poured water from a pitcher into a bowl and brought it to the bedside. "We must have more," she said. "I'll go." Nathaniel watched her begin to sponge the boy's face and neck. Then he caught up the pitcher as well as his own water skins and hurried out the door. The next 2 days were a nightmare. He made countless trips to the well. There was no way to keep the water cool for very long, so it had to be replaced. Milcah would soak the cloths in the cool water, wring them out, and place them on Joktan's chest, his legs, and his forehead. They had to be changed every few minutes. Often his tossing would dislodge them, and she would try to quiet him while Nathaniel replaced them. There was no rest for either of them. Milcah refused to leave her child's side, and Nathaniel did all he could to help her. She grew haggard with fatigue, her eyes like great dark smudges in her pale face. They could hear Elijah pacing above their heads, but he did not come down. The fever would not break. Joktan was delirious. He talked and even laughed now and then, but it made no sense. It was like he was in another time and place. His fever-dulled eyes roamed restlessly over their faces with no sign of recognition. Time and again Nathaniel held him, while Milcah tried to get him to drink. The water always trickled out the sides of his mouth and down his chin. At last, late on the second day, there came a time when he no longer thrashed about. "He's resting," Milcah said, her voice catching on a sob. "He'll be better now." The boy's chest rose and fell rapidly, and there was an ominous rattle in his throat. His skin was stretched tight over the bones of his face. Nathaniel's glance met hers, and he knew she did not believe her own words. They were both surprised when Joktan's eyes fluttered open and he turned his head. "Mother?" he whispered. Milcah stroked the damp curls from his forehead and kissed him. "I'm here, little one." He caught at her hand and closed his eyes. His breath left him in a long, shuddering sigh. They watched in vain for his chest to move, but he lay still. In the sudden silence, their own breathing sounded loud in their ears. It was over. Nathaniel staggered back as though struck. How could it be over? He wanted to scream. Milcah gathered the still form of her son in her arms and began to rock back and forth, her voice lifted in a keening wail. Nathaniel stumbled from the house, scarcely able to see through the tears that blinded him. He dropped to his knees and pounded at the unyielding ground with both fists. He did not know that Elijah had come down until he felt himself lifted in strong arms. "He's dead," he sobbed. "Joktan is dead." Elijah's stern features were softened with compassion, and for a moment he held the boy close. Then he stepped back and strode into the house. Nathaniel heard the note of authority in his deep voice when he spoke to Milcah. "Give the child to me," commanded the prophet of Yahweh. The sounds of her anguished grieving ceased, and Nathaniel stepped into the doorway to see her staring wide-eyed at Elijah. She looked down at the child in her arms and struggled to her feet as though in a dream. She did not resist when he took the boy from her with gentle hands. She followed him, her face awash with silent tears as he carried her son up the stairs to the roof. She stumbled once, and Nathaniel rushed to help her. Elijah placed Joktan on his own bed and began to pray. Nathaniel stood watching with Milcah as the prophet stretched himself over the child and called on the Lord to return his life to him. What was he doing? Had his grief unhinged him? Nathaniel glanced at the woman beside him. Her tears had stopped, and she was holding her breath. Again Elijah stretched himself over the child. "Lord, creator and sustainer of life," he cried, "I call on you now. Come and breathe life into Joktan and restore him to the arms of his mother." Such a thing wasn't possible. Was it? A third time Elijah stretched himself over the child. Nathaniel found himself trembling as he heard the words repeated. A long shudder went through Elijah, and then he stepped back. There was a faint stirring from the bed. Color was creeping into Joktan's waxen features, and with a tiny cough, his chest began to rise and fall in a natural rhythm. Milcah collapsed in a heap, but Nathaniel took one lunging step towards the bed. He could not control his shaking limbs. Elijah was speaking, but what was he saying? His voice seemed to be coming from a great distance. "Wake up, child. Your mother needs you now." Joktan opened his eyes and lifted himself on one elbow. His mouth stretched in a huge yawn. "I've been asleep," he said. "I had such a strange dream." "Go to your mother, Joktan. She's fainted, I think." The young boy looked to where his mother lay and scrambled from the bed to rush to her side. He called out to her, and she opened her eyes. When she saw him kneeling there, she gave a glad cry and reached for him with eager arms. Elijah came to lean on Nathaniel. He looked exhausted. "Come," he said. Let's leave them to their joy." Nathaniel did not think his legs would carry him down the stairs, but somehow he made it. Alone in the yard with Elijah, he voiced his confusion. "He was dead. I watched him die. You saw that he was dead, didn't you?" "We do not serve a small God," Elijah said. "With him, all things are possible." If Nathanael had not witnessed it with his own eyes, he never would have believed it. He was still struggling to understand when he became aware that the prophet was staring at him. "I'm sorry, did you say something?" "I'm leaving in the morning." Leaving? Of course. He was going to Israel, very likely to die. He would be gone already if Joktan had not gotten ill. Nathanael tried to imagine his life without Elijah. He could not. No matter what happened, he would not let the prophet face his fate alone. He reached out to lay a hand on Elijah's arm. "We will leave in the morning," he corrected. "If you're going to die, I might as well die with you." Chapter 18. The return journey was made in the open. After a tearful farewell from Milcah and Joktan, they headed south. Elijah was silent, preoccupied. For once, Nathanael didn't mind. He walked without even noticing where he put his feet. He relived the scene on the rooftop over and over in his mind and still struggled to grasp what he had witnessed. He lifted his eyes to the unbroken expanse of blue above him. "It wasn't a dream," he whispered. "Joktan was dead. And now he's alive. I don't understand it. I can't explain it. But I do thank you." They made good time, and after a while Nathanael began to enjoy being on the road again. The shadow of what awaited them in Israel remained, but now he began to tell himself that perhaps Yahweh did not intend for them to die. Perhaps he would continue to protect them. One day at a time, he told himself. There was no point in acting dead already. They reached Mount Carmel without any difficulty. When they stopped to rest in the hottest part of the day, Elijah looked long and hard at the mountain. Nathanael thought back to the broken altar they had discovered there and wondered if Elijah was remembering too. "Are we going to climb the mountain this time?" Elijah stood and made ready to go. "The time is coming," he said. "Not yet, though. Not today. We'll push on towards Megiddo until we find a suitable place to stop." It almost sounded like Elijah knew what was going to happen. What did this mountain have to do with it? Nathanael was curious, but he knew from experience that it would be useless to ask. He would just have to wait until Elijah decided it was time for him to know. The road to Megiddo was not nearly as traveled as it had been on their outward journey. They met few people and spoke little. Elijah was never one for idle conversation, and Nathanael was too caught up in his own thoughts to make any effort to draw him out. Several days had passed in this way when they found themselves approaching an oasis a few miles west of the city. Nathanael had been looking forward to this stop. There were trees for shade, and they needed water from the well there. As they drew nearer, he could see that there was a large party camped in the grove. There were 2 tents and a number of camels. Men lounged here and there, but there was no sign of any women or children. That made him uneasy. He slowed his pace. "Those men don't look like merchants," he observed. Elijah's eyes narrowed as he took note of the camp. "I count 6 of them, and you're right. They're not merchants. Do you see the trappings on those camels? This is someone of importance." They had stopped walking, and now one of the men noticed them and rose to his feet, staring in their direction. In an instant they were all up, alert and watchful. Even at this distance, Nathanael could see that they were armed. "We'd better keep moving, or they'll grow suspicious," he suggested. Just then, a tall old man emerged from one of the tents. One of the others spoke to him, and he shaded his eyes to look up the road. There was something familiar in the way he moved, but Nathanael could not make out his features. He seemed to be giving orders, and the men moved back to the far side of the grove, leaving him to wait alone as they approached. They were much nearer when Nathaniel caught at Elijah's sleeve to get his attention. "That's Obadiah," he said. Elijah nodded and kept walking until they stood face to face with the king's steward. Obadiah looked at the boy and gripped his shoulder in greeting. Then he turned his troubled gaze to the man. "This is bad," he warned. "You shouldn't have come here." "The time for hiding has passed," said Elijah. "I must find King Ahab. He's at the summer palace in Jezreel with the queen. He has sent me to search out water for his horses, but it's useless. Many of the wells are dry. Even the sheep are dying." Elijah's expression was grim. "And God's people?" he asked. "What of the sheep of his pasture?" Obadiah's shoulders sagged and his breath came out in a long sigh. "Jezebel has wrought carnage among those faithful to Yahweh. They're brought before Balak and made to swear allegiance to Baal. If they refuse, they're put to the sword. Many have died." Elijah's face went very still, and Nathaniel thought it was even more alarming than the passion he usually saw reflected there. "There are caves in the hills near Shechem," Obadiah went on. "I've helped some to escape and have hidden them there. There were about 100 people at last count. They're safe for now, but I don't know how much longer I'll be able to get food and water to them." Nathaniel gaped at the old man. He could just imagine the risks Obadiah must have taken to hide and feed so many. If he were ever discovered— Elijah's deep voice cut into his thoughts. "You have done much, Obadiah, yet I must ask you to do one more thing." Obadiah's response was quick. "If it's in my power, I'll do it." Elijah nodded. "Go to Jezreel. It's only a few miles to the northeast. Speak to Ahab, but be certain that the queen is not around when you do. Tell him I've returned and I wish to speak to him. Alone. I'll wait here for him." "The king's temper is far from certain these days," Obadiah warned him with a wry smile. "I'm placing my life in your hands in doing this. If you're not here when he comes, it will all be over for me." Elijah tilted his head in the direction the men had gone. "You could leave them to guard us," he suggested. Color stained Obadiah's cheeks, and he was quick to protest. "You must forgive me. I'm a realist. I've survived because I never do anything without counting the cost. No, your word is enough for me. Besides, they're not to be trusted. The whole country knows that the queen wants you dead." Nathaniel sat with Elijah and watched as Obadiah gave his orders. The men broke camp with the ease and efficiency of long practice. Many curious glances came their way, but no one approached them. Just as they were ready to pull out, Obadiah came over with a sack of provisions. "You might as well eat while you wait. Unless I'm much mistaken, the king will be here before morning." He clasped each of them by the hand, and then he was gone. They watched the dust cloud as the camels headed toward Megiddo. Nathaniel felt like he was being borne along on a strong current to some unknown destination. He was helpless to resist the flow of events. If the king came with soldiers, they'd be caught in a trap of their own making. He knew Elijah would not budge from this place. "Well, we're in for it now," he observed to no one in particular. He took up the provisions Obadiah had left and made his way to the nearest shade. It would be dark before they could expect a response to Elijah's summons. The stars were out, and they were sitting before a small fire when they heard the clatter of approaching hoofs. It was King Ahab, and he was alone. He swung down from his mount and strode into the firelight, a scowl on his handsome face. "So, you really are here." His expression was guarded as he faced the man he had been hunting for months. "Sit down," Elijah invited. King Ahab stiffened and Nathaniel winced. He was sure the man was not accustomed to such casual treatment. He breathed a sigh of relief when, after a moment, the king shrugged and lowered himself to a seat across the fire from his old enemy. Nathaniel drew back into the shadows to watch and listen. Elijah was nothing if not direct. "It's time to end this business," he declared. Ahab fingered the dagger at his belt. "There are those who say that your death is the only way to end it." "My death would solve nothing. The question would still remain. Which God will the people of Israel follow?" "And what do you suggest?" snapped the king. Elijah smiled, but there was no humor in his voice. "Gather the people on Mount Carmel 1 week from today. Make sure that the 450 prophets of Baal, supported by your queen's generosity, are there. I will also be there, I and the boy." "To what purpose?" demanded Ahab, his eyes narrowed. Elijah's brows lifted and he gave a shrug. "Why, to settle the question, of course, once and for all." Nathaniel searched the prophet's features for some sign of what was in his mind. He must have decided on this plan when they passed the mountain a few days ago, or perhaps even on that long-ago day of their first visit. It didn't seem like a very good plan to the boy. He hoped there was more to it than what he had heard. Ahab settled back and stared into the flames, his lips pursed as he considered. He ran his fingers through his hair and nodded as though coming to a decision. "Very well, then," he said, rising to his feet. "It shall be as you say. Perhaps your way is better, after all." He had caught up his horse's reins and was about to mount when he turned to face them once more. Elijah had remained seated. "Don't place too much hope in your ability to sway the people," he warned. "When Balak is through, they'll clamor for your death." Nathaniel gave an involuntary shudder as the king rode off into the darkness. He felt as though someone had touched the back of his neck with icy fingers. And that is where we're going to leave off for today. And I'm keen to find out where this all goes. And so I hope you'll join me next time. Be sure to hit the subscribe button if you enjoyed today's episode. Till next time, keep dreaming and God bless.